Thank you, Sebastian, and thanks everyone for coming. This was literally the topic given to me, and so I stuck with it. I actually don't talk too much about US politics, not so much because I'm afraid, but more because it is very hard to make sense of what is happening. You're kind of on a roller coaster, but it isn't on a clear track. So you don't really know where it's going, and every single time it goes somewhere, and people then think, okay, so if it goes straight, it will end up here. But then it takes a turn. And having lived through Trump 1.0, and having done all of these intellectual exercises of like every day trying to figure out, okay, so if it now continues to go straight, where does it end up? And then finding that it actually took a turn, it was exhausting, right? And so for purely mental health reasons, I followed the news modestly. And my policy today is if Trump says something, I ignore it. If he says it again a week later, I will start to note it. If other people start to talk about it who have any relevance, and there are not too many people who do in the Trump administration, then I will start thinking what that could mean. And it is very important to keep that in mind, particularly for those people who are very online. Like, the online community is not helping you. First of all, it responds to everything. And second of all, there's a kind of an economy of attention. And you get attention by having the most dramatic position. And so fascism isn't enough anymore. If you do not believe that we're going into civil war, you're not being heard. Now, I'm not saying that fascism or civil war are possible scenarios, because today in the US, you really cannot exclude anything. But they are among a whole range of scenarios, and in my opinion, not the most likely. Now, what am I going to do? I'm first going to argue that we're in the fourth phase of the post-war far right. That is the context that is important to understand what the far right today is and where it is different from what it used to be. And I feel that a lot of our debate still treats the far right a little bit as if we were in the 1980s, 90s. I'm going to talk about the return of Trump and explain why it was actually not inevitable. And particularly push back against narratives that have Trump as a kind of a Superman, with a cult of personality where people just devotedly follow him as they did Hitler, which incidentally, similar story. Hitler was also not a Superman. A lot of people just followed him because the alternatives were worse. Then I will speak about the new organization and to a certain extent mobilization, and yes, I will address social media too, but mostly because I will get a question about social media. I will also discuss Elon Musk for roughly the same reason. I will disappoint many of you by arguing that neither social media nor Musk are as important as everyone says they are. Then we come to the most depressing part. Yes, it gets worse, and that is counter strategies. And then finally, lessons for Europe, which there are. In part, one of the lessons is that Europe is not the US, or vice versa. Notes on terminology, I don't want to go there too much, but I use the right as anti-egalitarian. I focus on the far right, which is both the extreme right and the radical right. The extreme right is fundamentally anti-democratic. That means that they do not believe in popular sovereignty and majority rule. So they do not think that people should elect their own leaders. Think about historical fascism, National Socialism. There are very few openly extreme right actors today. Most are radical right, which means that they do believe that people should elect their own leaders, but they do not believe in minority rights, rule of law, independence of judiciary, media, things like that. What we call liberal democracy. The problem, though, is while this distinction theoretically is very clear, in practice, we have more and more actors who have both. Mostly actors that talk as if they accept democracy, but have problems with liberal democracy, but act in a way that undermines even democracy. Think about Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is actively undermining not just liberal democracy, but also particularly think about Trump, his support for January 6th, the uprising, his denial of the election results of 2020, which were actually the best organized elections probably in US history. And so as a consequence, increasingly scholars now use the term far right not to indicate the group of both extreme right and radical right actors, but actually certain actors which have both radical and extreme factions in them. Now, there is in the literature a distinction between different waves of post-war far right that comes from a German scholar called Klaus von Beime. He said that in 1945 to 55 there was the first wave of neo-fascism, mostly remnants of the past. A second wave of right-wing populism, 1955, roughly 1980, which was a combination of old fascism and kind of post-war phenomenon. It had a lot of people who were active in fascist groups of the 30s, 40s, but it also had people who weren't involved in that. It had issues like amnesty for collaborators, but it also had issues as immigration, post-war issues. So it was a kind of a transitional phase. And then the far right became more successful in the third wave, particularly electorally. That started in the 1980s and was particularly focused on the immigration issue. This is the easiest country to talk about it because actually the FPÖ was the most successful of all of them in Western Europe. In the third phase, the far right were seen as new and as outsiders, which even in the case of Austria was already problematic. Right? Obviously, the FPÖ wasn't new, and they were also not outsiders. Not by the time that they actually became far right under Jörg Haider. They were part of the system, even though they were not as entrenched as ÖVP or SPÖ. They were also seen as electorally and politically marginal, and that was the case in most of Western Europe. So in most of Western Europe, during the third phase, far-right parties were single-digit parties and were confronted with a cordon sanitaire, but meant that no one wanted to govern with them. There was one exception in Western Europe, which was the first Berlusconi government, which included the Lega Nord. Now, I've argued in my book, The Far Right Today, that today we're in the fourth phase that started roughly 2000, I think 9/11, and the interpretations of it were important. During the fourth phase, the far right has become part of the mainstream, which means that its issues have become broadly accepted as relevant, its discourse has become adopted, and they themselves have not only become electorally successful. According to a recent study, they are now the strongest party family as group of parties across Europe. But they've also become normalized as political actors. In a majority of EU member states, the far right has or does govern at the national or subnational level. At least centrist and right-wing parties in most countries now consider the far right as a normal potential coalition partner. But in certain countries, even left-wing parties will send a delegation to a far-right party congress. At the same time, it is very important to remember that the far right is very heterogeneous. There are huge differences in their electoral success, ranging from Fidesz at 50%, which of course free and unfair elections, but even if they would be free and fair, they would be in the 30–40%, at least 10 years ago, to parties in Iceland and Ireland that are 0 point something. There are parties that exist for 3–4 years. There are parties that exist for 70. There are parties that are represented in structurally, organizationally throughout whole countries, parties that have one member, the Party for Freedom. There are parties that are in their third or fourth government, parties that have never governed. So talking about the far right as if it is one bloc that all act the same and govern in the same way, have the same type of support, is not always helpful. Obviously, the electorate of a party that gets 40% is very different from the electorate of a party that gets 2%. Like, the electorate of Fidesz is roughly the Hungarian population. But the electorate of, in terms of like gender, age, education, those kind of things, it won't stand out that much because it's 50% of the population, right, that votes. But a party that gets 5% probably has some specifics. On average, but this is declining, right, your average voter is, which is interesting, never mentioned in Europe, white. Europeans get very nervous when you talk about categories of white or race. And that's all fine, but they're still white. They're male. Still roughly around 2/3 of the electorate is men, 1/3 is women. However, the more normalized and mainstream parties have a much smaller gender gap. And then generally they're lower educated, not necessarily poorer. In fact, there is a sizable portion in the electorate of far-right parties that does not have a college education, but has a very decent salary. This is in part because it includes older workers, but also kind of shop owners, for example. Right? And so, but as said, there are a lot of differences. And I think that's important because that also means that you have to be careful to see something in one country and then say, well, that will happen here too, because there are just massive differences, not only in the supply of the far right, but of course also the context. Now, let me first say that the US is obviously unique, as every country is unique, but the US has a uniquely difficult political system. And it is true that Europeans know much more about the US than Americans know about Europe. At the same time, I would argue that Europeans also a bit exaggerate their own knowledge about the US. One of the things I suffer whenever I go to Europe is I'm being America-splained by people who tell me how the life in America is. And yes, like you get a lot of information about it, but quite often the media is pretty decent on covering the parties, but very poor on covering the system. And so one of the things is the US is a federal system, but a much stronger federal system than anything else. It has also an extremely strong Supreme Court, and it is virtually impossible to change the Constitution. And that has massive consequences of what you can and cannot do in US politics. And actually, it explains to a large extent why Trump is ruling by executive order, which is very interesting because an executive order is pretty much just a statement. It holds no or very little legal power. The only reason why Trump at the moment can govern by executive order is because the Republicans in Congress allow him to. If they would say, we don't want this, then nothing happens, which is why the midterms in 2 years are so important. Right? Should it shift, then all these executive orders become just pieces of paper. Let's go to January 6th. I think we all remember. It was a pretty important day, 2021. A coup d'etat, a weird coup d'etat in many ways. I think January 6th is misunderstood in many circles. I don't think it was a planned coup d'etat. I don't think it showed necessarily the strength of the far right. Anyone who has ever gone, and I'm going to guesstimate not too many people, to a fairly rowdy soccer game and were among hooligans, will know that there is a crowd function, that once a mob starts to move, all kind of people who would never ever dream of being involved in that start to move with them. The people that ended up in Congress, like, if you would have asked them probably a day before, like, would you storm Congress? They would have said, of course not. That's insane, right? But once the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys started to move, and importantly, once the police, Capitol Police, didn't actually hold them out, everything just rolled. And the real reason why the Capitol was stormed was the fact that Trump was in power. And Trump didn't want to bring in the National Guard, which he now very happily disperses through California. Had there been the National Guard, 2,000 National Guard, no one would have breached that. Now, January 6th was an amazing 3 weeks. I think it was 3 weeks. Let's say 4. On the day, the days after, virtually every single Republican of note came out against it. And then without any clear indication why, because Trump himself was actually a bit absent, everything shifted. And within weeks, within the whole Republican Party, it now became legitimate protest. It became even free speech. People started to talk about it as a touristic excursion. The person who represents my town, for example, who is also on video trying to barricade the Senate room to keep them out. And so, out of nowhere, from an attempt to kind of get rid of the extremism and Trump, they went full-on extremist, supporting, embracing what was a coup d'etat. But what was also important, that the real coup d'etat was actually inside of Congress. Because inside of Congress, there was a significant minority of Republican members of Congress who voted against the legitimate, the official recognition of the 2020 election results. So what happened, weirdly enough, Trump himself kind of started to disappear a bit in those first 2 years. And during the midterms, the majority of Republicans wanted the party to move on from Trump. The midterms were very bad for Trump candidates. And Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, was the new man. It was the man where all the money was, where all the establishment support was. The Wall Street Journal, the Koch brothers, Fox News, every poll that Republicans did were all favoring DeSantis. And then DeSantis imploded, because DeSantis was a terrible candidate, and because I think particularly DeSantis had exactly the same problem as Clinton, namely Trump. Trump has one thing, and that is authenticity. Trump says whatever he wants, and it is real. He lies, but even that is real. Because when he lies, he thinks it's true. Right? And honestly, it is remarkable. I mean, it's very rare, and I cannot remember any other politician ever in my life that is so authentic. And that makes professional politicians like Hillary Clinton and Ron DeSantis look terrible. Every attempt at authenticity looks so fake next to him. And so DeSantis, who is really the most plastic of the politicians that we had out there, like, just was nothing in that era. And so the weird thing was, and it's really interesting, you should go back to all of the coverage in the weeks after the midterms. Trump was dead. We had moved on. Trump announced that he was going to run. It was an extremely boring press conference at Mar-a-Lago. It was what he would himself call low energy. And it was so bad that Fox News moved away. Live, halfway, they were just like, okay, we can't do this anymore. Like, others have moved on before, but Fox News moved. And so that is the point where we are halfway. And it's important because too much of the discourse about Trump is kind of Trump Superman. Trump is this unique figure that has characteristics that make people devote to him. If that were to be the case, we wouldn't be at that situation. So the implosion of DeSantis is very important. He became a liability for big money. And Trump returns and then gets people shooting at him, gave a huge momentum, I think just as the stabbing of Bolsonaro had done before. But most importantly, the Democrats self-destructed. After a massive campaign by particularly the New York Times, Biden became pretty much no longer defensible, which not necessarily take a position on that. Obviously, he hadn't deteriorated recently. He was exactly the same as they were 2 years ago. The thing is, the midterms were seen as good for the Democratic Party. And so Biden, who can blame him, said, that's me. Right? So I should run for another term. And then, what was it, 5 months or something before the election, they push him out, leaving only one candidate, Kamala Harris, who was not necessarily the strongest candidate, but who ran a decent campaign. But the campaign was written for Biden. An old white man, seen as centrist. And now you had a black woman, who is by definition seen as radical. So in the end, importantly, the election was lost by the Democrats. Right? Trump won a little bit. The Democrats lost almost 7 million votes compared to 2020. So when we talk about the power of Trump, right, we should always contextualize it. In part, he is the one eye in the land of the blind. Now, what has happened? Trump 1.0 was a right-wing coalition. It was a coalition between the old Republican Party, personified by Mitch McConnell, still then a powerful leader in Congress, and the far right surrounded around Trump. It only got done, those things, where they agreed. So Trump 1.0 was very successful in tax cuts for the rich, which both Trump and McConnell supported. Deregulation, same thing. And defunding of the state. Everything else that was specific to Trump was either completely unsuccessful, the wall, he barely built anything, or modestly successful, the so-called economic nationalism. But after losing, so when he came to power, he had no infrastructure. There was no Trumpian party structure, but there was also not really a prominent far-right element within the Republican Party yet. That changed, of course, during his power, but then in opposition, a lot has changed too. And so by the time that Trump runs again, we have a complete marginalization of the old right. The American Enterprise Institution has for decades been the most powerful and most relevant right-wing think tank. It is completely sidelined. Like, when it organizes events, only liberals come. It has no connections to the Trump administration. But there's also been a transformation of some key institutions. College Republicans, for example, the college Republicans at my university split over Trump in 2016. They're completely pro-Trump in 2020 and 2024. But the most important institution is the Heritage Foundation. And Heritage is also a long-standing think tank, which was mostly a policy factory that wrote policies for fossil fuel industry and whatever. It was very conservative in small government, pro-business, etc. Particularly the last couple of years, they have a new leader called Kevin Roberts, who is openly far-right and who is very close to Orban and others. And Heritage today is just a far-right organization. There's virtually not a Republican left in the old school one. And we have had a whole host of new organizations that are not in any way created by Trump or even led by him, but who support his agenda. The most important from me as an academic is Turning Point USA, which is a student group, which also has a professor watch list, for example. At most universities today, if there's any right-wing activity, it is through TPUSA. It's not through college Republicans. They're completely irrelevant. Now, this is an organization of Charlie Kirk, who is very close to Trump, and particularly his son. It's a very large organization. There are other organizations, mostly of people who played major roles in Trump 1.0. Think about Stephen Miller, who has his own think tank, other think tanks. So at the moment, you have a whole far-right infrastructure, which by and large has replaced the traditional Republican infrastructure. Again, it's important they are not necessarily Trumpian organizations. And so whereas Orban has full control over Fidesz and everything related to Fidesz, that is not the case with Trump. Actually, Trump probably barely knows these organizations exist. Trump 2.0 is solidly far-right. There's virtually not an element in it that isn't far-right. But it is not homogeneously far-right. It is a very diverse coalition of various versions of far-right, ranging from Christian nationalists to pure white supremacists who don't care about religion, to techno-fascists, to pretty much everything. And importantly, while working together, as in the often mentioned Project 2025, Project 2025 was a project by Heritage, but pretty much all the different far-right groups could get something in it. But it is completely unclear who has power and for how long. And one of the best examples of that is Elon Musk, right? Who goes from all-powerful, allegedly it was Elon Musk who was the real president and Trump was the puppet. And then Elon Musk was gone. In Trump 1.0, Steve Bannon was allegedly president and Trump was the puppet. And then Steve Bannon was gone. Right? And so the only one who holds power is Trump. And if you're not in a good book with Trump, you have no basis. Social media. social media is an obsessive focus of other media, as well as of young people. Everything started with Twitter. Not young people, because they're not on Twitter. But everything started with social media. As Austrians, you should know that there was a far right before social media. A very strong far right before social media. Social media mostly radicalized people who were already in the far right camp or potential far right camp. Social media is echo chambers. But it's not, this idea of echo chambers is there's someone who has absolutely no visions. There are no priors. They just go on Twitter, they see Musk, and they become a Nazi. That's not how influence works. Most people who have no visions and interest in politics are not on Twitter, first of all. Most active people on Twitter are very political. They don't change. They seek other people who have their views. And so the only thing that that does, to a certain extent, is they radicalize it, because you're all the time confirmed, and it can shift the focus. So not so much your position, but now, because you are for white people, you are against the Democrats, you are against the liberal order, but now you're for Putin, because that is at the moment what you're busy with. And then you go to another issue. But fundamentally, you stay ideologically the same. So that's what social media largely does. Most of the more solid research on social media influence, particularly on electoral behavior, shows that it has a very small impact. About 10% of Trump voters were influenced by it. And that is about, I would say, 2% of American people in 2016. Tech bros, I've made my point about Musk and Bannon. I'm not saying that Musk is completely irrelevant or can't come back. He's groveling at the moment, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Also, I'm very concerned of what information he has acquired over the last months. But outside of that, he has actually done very little. He has defunded all kinds of organizations. Most would have been defunded by virtually any other Republican. They all hate the same type of institutions. The tech bros are actually also very heterogeneous. Elon Musk is very different from Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel, who pays your former prime minister, is someone who believes pretty much in techno-fascism. He believes that some smart people should rule the world and innovate it into prosperity. Elon Musk is clearly a white supremacist. Zuckerberg has very little political agenda, seems mostly aggrieved that people don't see him as a genius, right? And then you have Google people who just want to make money, and Bezos, right? And so they're all over the place. They hate each other, but they also hate the left, the Democrats even more. Sometimes this one is in favor, sometimes that one is in favor. In the end, the only one who decides who is in favor is Trump. I think overall social media still more reflects society than that it shapes it. The radicalization that you see on social media is the radicalization that we have seen in society in the last decades. The radicalization didn't start on social media, it started on Christian radio, it started on talk radio in the US, and then through Fox. It's not Musk, it's Rush Limbaugh, who you might not know, but Rush Limbaugh transformed the US far more than Elon Musk ever did, and he was this right-wing talk radio host. And I lived for a while in Indiana when I would drive up from roughly Indianapolis to South Bend, where Notre Dame University is. As soon as you're 10, 15 miles out of Indianapolis, you only have two types of radio. which is right-wing talk radio and Christian radio. And they, by and large, have the same message, right? And so radio is far more important in the US than people realize. The power of social media is indirect. It is the social media sets the agenda of the traditional media. The fact is that most journalists and politicians are extremely online. Now it has changed a little bit with Twitter, but that took a long time. But for a very long time, journalists thought that Twitter was the real world. That Twitter was where you saw what people truly thought. That they wouldn't say that in public, but there it was the authentic kind of world. Now, we actually know that Twitter is a very small part of the world. First of all, almost no one under 30 is on it. Second of all, I think about, what was it, 1% of the users of Twitter create 80% of the content. Right? So it's an extremely skewed world, which is particularly right-wing and reactionary. However, whatever happens on Twitter comes into the mainstream media. And so Trump didn't win in 2016 because of Twitter. He won because of CNN and the New York Times. Because mainstream media all the time talked about what he did on Twitter. If they wouldn't have done that, then 2 million people, the people who followed him, might have read it. Of those 2 million, let's take out 500,000 of political scientists and journalists and just freaks who like to see crazy stuff. Right? The rest would be people who were solidly Trump already. So no influence in there. So social media today mostly has influence because of traditional media. And if you want to talk about media influence, for me, what is much more important in the rise of the far right is the privatization of traditional media. If we would still have traditional media linked to churches, trade unions, or the state in general, without a neoliberal logic in it, then all of these things that happen on social media would be filtered. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that at the moment, the media picks up on everything because everything is about profit. And the profit margin of media is this. They're all the time close to bankruptcy. And so they jump on everything they think is important. And again, they think what is online is important. The counter strategies. I think this is the one thing that particularly I notice in European media, as well as from my European friends, is something that has been shocking. First of all, you have commercial or corporate compliance. It's important that Trump 1 was also embraced by big business, particularly stock market business. Now, to be fair, Trump 1 had a narrative that Trump was irrelevant and that the adults in the room were going to make sure that he wouldn't do something stupid. We don't have adults in the room anymore. But the market is happy with Trump, or was until he started the tariffs. Like, and you can see the stock market like boom after he wins. There's nothing surprising. Like, this is not a Marxist theory of fascism. Like, fascism are not like the boot boys of capitalism. Capitalism always hedges its bet. And so big business gives both to the Democrats and the Republicans. But once in power, you will work with power. The media has clearly shifted. And this has to do with two things, in my opinion. First of all, owner structure. Washington Post and Bezos, LA Times and someone other, businessmen. Like, these are people who make a lot of money doing business with the state. They often lose money on their newspaper. They're not going to risk their business over the newspaper. The second thing is that in 2016, Trump won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote by 2.5 million votes. And so there was this argument that we have to accept him, but he's not really representing the majority. in election night, Trump had more than 50% of the vote. In the end, it is actually a little bit less. But that created the narrative of he has a popular mandate. And so the argument now was he speaks for the American people, as if the other 50% no longer counts. And that played a major role. And the New York Times is very clear on that. It's all the time like arguing that position. But what it also, of course, does is that it downplays discontent. It downplays the protests that are there. It normalizes, and I think that's very important, the Trump regime and he himself. Right? I mean, Trump has just an onslaught of absolutely batshit crazy social media posts or activities. This is not about the politics of it. Like, this is purely about how he responds. Like, we have seen the Zelensky, we have the Truth Social post. Like, if anyone else does that, you have a whole debate of, is this guy still fully there, right? We don't have that on Trump. We have had a year of daily articles about, is Biden still there? Is he too old? Biden drops out, the whole issue of age, gone, right? The whole issue of dementia, gone. And so those are important things. The Democratic Party today is less popular than the Republican Party. Just let that sink in. Like, usually when you have someone who is just all over the place, you just have to sit. Like, you just do a Keir Starmer, and by and large don't say anything, and you roll into power. The Democrats kind of do that, and yet are still historically unpopular. One, because they were initially also buying into the same as popular mandate. Well, he won the majority, so we have to listen to him. Two, the leadership, as far as there is a leadership, but Chuck Schumer, for example, is completely out of date with pretty much everything. The leadership of the Democratic Party is very old. But also, the Democratic Party has a very heterogeneous base, much more heterogeneous than the Republican Party. The electorate of the Republican Party, I think, is about 70% white, is probably even larger Christian and finding religion important, right? Is anti-left, is concerned about the same type of things. The Democratic electorate is pretty much a representation in racial terms of the electorate. It still is a plurality white, but it has 82% of African American voters, probably 90% of African American women, quite a lot of Hispanics, etc. They're all over the place on many issues. Right? And so on Gaza, they were split. The electorate of the Democratic Party was split on Gaza almost 50-50 for the first year. The electorate of the Republican Party was probably 90% pro-Israel, 10% anti. It's a basic anti-Semitic kind of electorate. Right? And the other 90% is just whatever. Right? Israel can do whatever. So it's very easy to take a position on that. Harris could not have taken a position in the election that would have won her. Right? If she would have been strongly pro-Israel, she would have won a little bit of support from some Jewish voters. But the American Jews that care a lot about Israel are largely Republican now. The American Jewish population is increasingly split. And so there are other issues where they're also very divided, including issues that have to do with race. Actually, I would say what American political scientists call racial conservatism, what I would call racism, is remarkably widespread among white voters of Democratic parties. Like whenever I see a survey about nativist views or racist views, I see the percentage of Republicans, I think, yeah, sure. And then you see that the Democrats is only 20% lower. You're like, right? And so any type of welfare program is actually pretty tricky for a Democratic Party. There's a passivity of the public. It's not unique to the US. My country, the Netherlands, the country of ultimate complacency, right, had a far-right government, didn't seem to bother anyone, just moved on. In the US, that's not the case. Like in the Netherlands, there are actually the vast majority things, it's fine, we'll manage. Huge portion of Americans are very concerned. They don't come out. Now, why is that? Now, let's not forget that this is a humongous country. Right? So if you organize a protest in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, then the largest trip that anyone has to do is 2.5 hours. And that would be almost impossible. Right? If I go to my city, I drive 1.5 hours. I drive 1.5 hours to get to the airport. Like, if I drive to DC, that's 13 hours. And I live on the East Coast. So like, it's enormous. Organizing anything requires so much effort. And if it doesn't happen in DC or New York, it doesn't happen. Like, you can bring together 100,000 people in whatever, Boulder, Colorado, like, but there are no journalists in Boulder, Colorado. So it has to happen there. So that plays a role. But I also think civil society in the US is indeed very large, as Alex de Tocqueville already wrote in the late 19th century. But it mostly performs tasks that in Europe are done by the state. They're not anti-state. They're not to check the state. They're actually replacing the state. Churches take care of food. Right? They are the social, like, hangnet. And that plays a role. And so civil society, on average, is not actually involved in opposing the state. Even in Black Lives Matter, for example, was a spontaneous movement. Most of the traditional civil society only came later. We always think back to the civil rights movement, which was an amazing movement, but also the exception to the rule. So the public is leaderless. There's no leadership in the Democratic Party. There's no leadership in civil society. And they're overwhelmed. And I think it is important to realize that Trump is not Kickel. Trump is not Wilders. It is at a level so much more extreme, with a state so powerful, particularly in terms of repression, that to just deal with that eats up your energy. Like it is just every single day you wake up, and there is something happening that requires all your energy of a week. Just think about what's happening at the moment in California. Partly a side story, but because at the same time he's still destroying universities and going after judges and like having razzias that put people in Sudan. But he's now bringing Marines to California, which is unconstitutional, but it's nevertheless happening. He's now ordering riots, ICE, in democratically controlled cities, hoping that there will be similar responses as in LA, so that he can proclaim the Insurrection Act, which would allow him to use the US military forces on US soil, right? That's not just a scandal. That's not Ibiza, right? That goes to the core, and we have that on a daily basis. So it's very difficult to find your target. I think that's why Musk was so important. And so this is a protest in my town, and it was a protest across the US in everything town. It was actually a fairly decent turnout. But one of the things that was very typical was that almost everyone was focused on Musk. Musk was a very good target. He's very easy to hate, right? But at the same time, Musk is gone, right? And so this whole cause is kind of lost. But if you protest almost anything, 2 days later, it doesn't exist anymore. Gaza plan, like, gone. Like, Muslim ban, gone. Like, and so, when you have so many moving targets, it's just incredibly hard. There's no overarching topic, because when the Women's March happened, which was still the largest protest in US history, it had a very clear agenda: abortion. Right? That was the trigger. Today, you're all over the place. That being said, there are a lot of small protests. The problem is they're all local, and the media is uninterested. Like, even on this day that we had protests across the US in really significant numbers, it took until well into the afternoon for national media to start to cover it. And on social media, you could already see pictures of like massive demonstrations. But the media is uninterested. Now, are there lessons for Europe? Again, let me state that the US is a unique country in terms of its size, incredibly complex system. I would say also extremely high tolerance for racism, which is not to say that Europeans don't have it, but they have not as long of a history. I think what is fundamental is that we rethink far-right politics. We still think about the far-right being there. The far-right is something that only the far-right does. Far-right politics is whatever the far-right says. Anyone who's not far-right doesn't do far-right politics. That's not how the world works anymore. Right? Here we have Meloni, the most successful far-right politician in Europe today, and Frederiksen, allegedly a social democrat from Denmark, who are spearheading yet another anti-immigration plan. Right? Frederiksen is the darling of the far right today. Nativist politics come from everywhere. So the far right is not a skinhead. Like, even today in the newspaper, when you see a picture around the story of the far right, it is often like some kind of skinhead with like a swastika tattooed on the back of his head. Like, as I tell my students, it's your grandpa or your uncle. Right? But the mainstream is also not that liberal democratic bloc that is anti-racist, that is pro-tolerance, that sees the far right as something very different. The mainstream includes the far right in most cases, right? And it includes far right issues. And so if you fight far right politics, you also fight in part the mainstream. And one of the problems I have with what is called anti-fascist politics, or whatever you want to call it, is that they often are extremely critical about the far right. Whatever the far right says is seen as an indication of their racism, and very forgiving towards mainstream parties. When mainstream parties introduce nativist politics and say, well, we have to do it, otherwise the far right comes, everyone says, oh yeah, no, we have to do that. What does it matter who introduces the racist politics? The problem is the racist politics. So we have to prepare. Austria, not the best example, right? You've had some experience, but we all know that you will have another government coming. They're going to govern one day again, whether it's Kickel or someone else. clearly the Democrats were completely unprepared for Trump 2.0. Also, European leaders were completely unprepared for Trump 2.0, which I think is just criminal incompetence. As we have done with the far right for decades, we just try to wish them away. And so when they come, then we have to start to think about, okay, so what should we defend? Right? Now, I think if I would interview 100 leading politicians and ask, what is liberal democracy? Like, what are the core values, core institutions? I think probably a sizable portion will fail that exam. But particularly if you look at the discourse of politicians today, it's a very narrow majoritarian type discourse. It is a discourse where the people are homogeneous, where the people are more conservative than the people really are. We have actually empirical research that shows that both journalists and politicians think that the population is much more right-wing than they actually are. Right? And so, liberal democracy is about majority rule and minority rights. The majority cannot do everything. It is about independence media and independence of judiciary. Those are fundamental. Any aspect of that, undermining that, for whatever reason, goes to the core of liberal democracy. Right? If you don't understand that, then you can't set red lines. And one of the things that we see is that parties start to work with the far right, either in government or making laws, and not really thinking it through. They think, well, this policy doesn't do anything bad. But the underlying ideology of that policy does actually go against minority rights or against pluralism, which means that logically the next policy is going to undermine liberal democracy. And finally, I think what is absolutely crucial is that liberal Democrats, whatever their specific ideology is, should start setting the agenda again. The agenda has been set by the far right for almost the whole 21st century. Since 9/11, we have been talking about national identity, we have talked about the failure of multiculturalism, we have talked about the security threat of immigration, the lack of immigration, all these kind of things. Even now we're talking about climate change having gone too far, also a discourse that comes from the EPP, but there's very strong far-right elements in it. We have an agenda of don't vote for the far right, or the far right are fascist, or the far right are racist, particularly towards minorities or marginalized groups, right? They know. They actually know much better than us, non-minorities, and they know much longer. Right? There's no African American who thinks that Trump is not a racist. Right? The point is that they're not convinced that the Democrats are not racist. And the Democrats do not actually offer them anything to believe that they're not racist. So anti-fascism can always only be part of the struggle. The struggle is to strengthen democracy. Because in the end, like, the far right is not the cause of the problems of democracy. It is the consequence of it. We have a far right because people are not happy with the way liberal democracy functions. And if you ban them, people are still not happy with the way liberal democracy functions. However, if you make people happier about the way that liberal democracy functions, you will have less far right. Right? Now, how do you do that? Not by ignoring so-called far right issues. Of course, you have to talk about immigration, because it is a concern. But you can talk about immigration in all kinds of different ways. For example, if you talk about asylum seekers, human rights issue. If you talk about immigrants, you can talk about aging populations, You can talk about welfare state. You can also talk, if you're more conservative, about limiting it and having a light culture, whatever you want to do. That is not necessarily undemocratic or against liberal democracy. But you have to do it within that context, right? Alternative issues and positions are also about who are you trying to reach. All parties these days are trying to find the same voter, by and large, which is an older white, mostly men, who is reactionary and potentially votes for the far right. All except of the Greens, right? And here neos, right? Niche parties who have niche electorates. But the mainstream right, the mainstream left, and the far right are obsessed with the same voter. The problem for the mainstream left, Social Democrats, is that that voter is not going to vote for you. You didn't lose them, and you're not going to win them. Now, the voter that you should chase are young women. Young women are far more progressive than anyone else, women or men. Young women care about the issues that traditionally social democratic parties care about, including welfare state and just state in general, climate change, etc., etc., etc. Right? And young women vote less than other groups. So they're a huge potential electorate. And they're young, which means that they can vote for a long time. Unlike the average electorate of social democratic parties, which is old and dies off by every election. And so if that isn't enough to clip the focus to young women, then I don't know what is. Thank you.